Hey guys, my name is Mason Bates. I'm a graduate student with Illinois State University studying procedural generation, and I'm here to give you a brief overview of procedural world building. Before I get started, I want to let you guys know that I'll be referencing a number of different concepts and ideas from multiple academic papers, along with different games as examples. So, if you're interested in playing these sort of games that I talk about, or reading a bit more in depth, I'll be linking everything in the description down below for you. But, without further ado, let's get started. So what is procedural world building? Well, it's the practice of building a world by means of procedural content generation, or PCG for short, which means using systems, equations, and either noise or randomness to automatically generate content for the product, a game in our case. PCG can be used for a whole host of things, generating terrain, narrative encounters, buildings, levels, simulations, and much, much more. Notably, anytime you're looking at content that's generated uniquely within a game experience, be it for a world or just an event, that content is procedurally generated. PCG is also a great tool for developers to quickly and easily make content that would normally take many times longer to handcraft, and can often make a world feel unique, alive, and responsive to the player in a way that pre-planned or traditional content can fail to. However, PCG is also often criticized for being repetitive and dreary, and, when misused, can make even enjoyable games feel drawn out or obnoxiously iterative. Whenever you work on procedurally generating a system or idea, you first need to have a strong idea of the subject that you're trying to generate. You need to have a deep understanding of what makes that subject important to the project, both inside and out. So to understand procedural world building, we first need to understand what world building is really about. Obviously, world building involves constructing the setting of the game, but it's easy to oversimplify that concept. World building really establishes the geography, landmasses, environments, and the climates of the world. It populates that world with peoples and cultures. It creates major structures, places of importance, and cultural centers, and often it develops the history and narrative significance of the world as well. When looking at creating each of those aspects of world building, it's easy to see why procedural generation as an alternative is so appealing. The ability to take what can be tens of thousands of hours of work, reducing it to a single computer and a handful of hours constructing equations is certainly an enticing option. In games, however, procedurally created worlds still seem to be the vast minority of those released each year. Why is that? Because many of the games holding their world building on a fundamental pillar rooted in the narrative story or the delivery of the mechanics. Without good world building, game mechanics and narrative can quickly fall apart. And while procedural world building may be an enticing time saver, the level of expertise required to do it well limits the situation where it can be used to create the settings of a new game. That isn't without precedent either. Many developers fail to implement satisfying procedural world building in a way that enhances the gameplay, which is hardly surprising. In world building, there are always so many events, peoples, places, cultures, groups, and more that are constantly interacting with each other. It's a tangled mess that more traditional writers have been practicing for generations to turn into a beautiful web of a story. This is probably why world building is seen as an entirely human art, or at least long has been. We used it to tell stories around a campfire, talk about the creation of the world, and of course, create absolutely fantastic books that we just cannot get our heads wrapped up enough in. Especially in the past century, world building as an art of literature has really been pushed into the fantasy genre. Many writers known for their world building are equally known for the years, if not decades, they spent focusing on singular elements of their world to make the story as enticing as possible. Each of these worlds was a well-crafted gem and created the inspiration for works like Dungeons & Dragons and innumerable other RPGs that are played, both digital and analog to this day. There are lots of great videos going over what precisely makes for good world building, but the TLDR of it is, good worlds need to have well-developed peoples, cultures, environments to be explored, they need to have engaging events, places, and landmarks to witness, but, most importantly, they need to have cohesiveness and interconnection between the world, a great web of cause and effect that the reader can see unfold. If world building has met those three bullets, you can probably count your world building as done well. The trouble being that each of those things takes years to fully flesh out. Answering one question about the people you'll see in the world will open up 3 more doors to entirely different questions you hadn't thought of, creating an unending labyrinth of questions that any writer will need to navigate through in order to get their world finished within the millennia. This is why major books that rely heavily on world building rarely cover more than a small handful of major events, because if each event affects and tugs at another, changing the trajectory of the world, Adding an additional major event makes that web of world building exponentially harder to manage. This could also be one of the few advantages that procedural world building could be seen to have over traditional world building. Creating systems that generate events, cultures, peoples of the world can result in many different simultaneous stories and events that would normally be too much to manage for a single writer in world building, opening the door for far vaster and more interconnected worlds through sheer processing power. That reliance on systems rather than an author also leaves themes or motifs of the world often to be more ambiguous, with concepts such as good and evil or right and wrong often being much more reliant on the thoughts and ideas of the audience rather than that of the author, since the system doesn't have its own direct bias. Another notable change in procedural worlds is often how small you can sometimes feel in them. Traditionally, the main character, along with potentially a handful of others, are often seen as influential keys of the world, and their actions will have far-reaching and world-shaping consequences far beyond themselves and for many years to come. That's a big change from many procedural worlds, where the player rarely has that profound impact on the world itself, and, if they do, it's often because the player controls many individuals, perhaps even whole nations, rather than a single character. To that extent, procedural worlds support the thought that history is not the works of one or two people, but the collective and infinitely complex cogs of a million more. When you start to look at how different systems of world building are with writers versus procedural world building, the differences start to pile up. Now, procedural world building starts to look very different than what we might traditionally think of. Take, for example, one of the biggest games to date, Minecraft. Minecraft obviously doesn't hold to the high standards of world building as far as traditional fantasy literature is concerned. It doesn't have any major events, it doesn't have any named characters, no impending doom, only the occasional scattered structure. Yet, despite it all, Minecraft's world still captures the imagination and enjoyment of millions of players. Minecraft's world features caves, abandoned mines, dungeons, villages, temples, mansions, buried treasures, witch huts, igloos, shipwrecks, forts, and golems, bandits, villagers, monsters, bosses, even otherworldly dimensions via exploration, hunting, and rituals. All of that and more. Especially when left largely unpopulated, it leaves the player in the world to revel in the confusion and wonder at the story that there is behind these massive structures often left in ruins. There are even hints of more, linking to the inevitable feeling of interconnectivity between worlds. Ever feel like you find yourself noting more abandoned mine shafts or bandit towers when you're closer to a village? Or note that the more you populate a village with light, the more monsters seem to gather around the edge of the village at night? Now, of course, Minecraft isn't a game that's built around narrative world building in a traditional fashion, but through the creation and construction of the world and elements, we can begin to see the connecting tissue that drives us to tell our own stories within the game and live in the worlds that are more than just there for the resources, but also there to build our curiosity. Minecraft is an example of rudimentary procedural world building done well. It's used to support the story where the player sees it and indicate important or interesting things in the world, but not to the exclusion of other elements within the game. Now, of course, Minecraft's world is only very loosely strung together. After all, the mechanics behind its procedural world building aren't intended to be narrative world building as seen in traditional literature, but rather as a means to support the open world that the player mines, explores, and builds in. If we want to look at the world and build a bit more mystery behind it, we'll have to reference another game known not only for its procedural world, but rather its procedural worlds. No Man's Sky is a game covered in controversy in its opening games, but has made a comeback after release backing up some of its earlier claims, or so Steam reviewers would have you believe. No Man's Sky, much like Minecraft, creates an open world, or perhaps even open universe game for the player to explore, filled with alien races, massive and ancient structures, long-lost people and religions, and quests to guide you through the center of the galaxy. Especially recently, the game has been praised for how much more populated the worlds feel, and how much there is to do even in small areas of the galactic map as a whole. Here, the world is more interconnected. Performing certain tasks will guarantee the prosperity of particular groups or individuals on selected planets, and each provide the player a reason to explore throughout the world. Aliens each have their own motivations for doing what they are, and you can learn their languages and start to understand more of what they say over time. Here, each planet the player visits, in addition to its own landscapes, environments, and structures, shows its history and significance in the wider scale of the world throughout monuments and the interactions of current inhabitants. Unlike Minecraft, the procedural worlds of No Man's Sky aren't a side effect of the rest of the mechanics of the game, or used as an extra pillar of gameplay, but is rather foundational to the very core of the game itself. However, both Minecraft and No Man's Sky have something in common. The world building shown in them is not directly shown to the character, instead being more of a setting of the wider experience, compared even to other narrative games that put an emphasis on world building, such as BioShock, Fallout, Fable, or the like. Procedural worlds seem to struggle to give more direct narrative experiences found in the worlds that otherwise would be more traditionally constructed. Worlds seen in both Minecraft and No Man's Sky rarely, if ever, establish a hard history, instead leaving it to the imagination of the player, which, while potentially enjoyable in some respects, prevents some of the same brilliant moments and breathtaking feelings that more established worlds can produce. Whereas other worlds and the narratives intertwined with them will tell intentional stories, procedural worlds often seem to struggle to tell any intentional story at all, often due to the focus on the construction of the physical world rather than the construction of the narrative one. That seems to be the largest consistent weakness of procedural world building, but it's not one that doesn't have its exceptions. A game released in 2006, Dwarf Fortress, is hardly the same huge game played by millions like No Man's Sky or Minecraft, but it has a very strong cult following. Many of those who play tout the storytelling of the game to be immersed into almost a frightening degree. Dwarf Fortress is entirely procedurally generated. Everything from your starting dwarves, to the environment, to the characters and the creatures found throughout the world, even the 200 years of history generated along with the terrain and kingdoms that can be found completely unique through each and every playthrough. It doesn't suffer from the same issues with world building that we noted in Minecraft or No Man's Sky. Each character has their own goals, they work together to achieve quests, there are writings in ancient temples that can be read, kingdoms each have their own unique heroes, and characters you can interact with in a variety of ways. When you play Dwarf Fortress, in many ways the narrative and world building feels like it's written more traditionally, largely due to the insanely complex and well-developed systems it uses to create and run its world. Dwarf Fortress was released in 2006, but it's been in continuous development since, and is worked on full-time by the developers to this day. Dwarf Fortress shows how procedural world building, in many ways, can start to more closely resemble the worlds built by traditional methods, and presents itself as an inspiration to many more procedural world building in games. Even games from the AAA industry are starting to use it as an example to how they can enhance narratives in their game using procedurally generated content. While each of the games we looked at there were completely procedurally generated, procedural world building can also be more in a supportive role. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a great example of this, generating a number of several mini-narrative events that allow you to establish your character more effectively within the world. Often these events can even come back to bite or reward you appropriately based on your previous interactions with those characters, cementing the game's theme on karma and the wildness of the dying West. Many games choose to utilize procedural world building to provide unique experiences to the player that are often or perhaps even nearly indistinguishable from pre-written content, and such narrative practices have been establishing themselves as a staple, especially in open-world games. But even in otherwise more linear games, to give characters a chance to express themselves or explore other unique concepts in the world, and provide a bit of extra replayability. This use of procedural world building is really interesting because it is used to provide an almost entirely narrative and character-driven experience to the game that it's a part of, an area of weakness often associated with procedural content generation as a whole. After all, world building has always been in the realm of human understanding, an art performed by experts that takes decades to craft long-adored universes, characters, and entire franchises. When most people think of an art, they normally compare it to the sciences, noting things like it isn't an exact science and that art can't be replicated. In the eyes of many, art is something that can capture human emotion and fascination in the way that the sciences fail to. World building is, in many ways, the accumulation of some of the chief concept of arts, since it requires the author to understand the human experience so thoroughly that they can describe the actions of entire nations of individuals in the lands they inhabit. Much like many other arts, world building isn't something that's easily taught, but rather something that's felt through and experienced by the reader. This may be why, to myself at least, seeing the expansion and trajectory of procedural world building, while I'm excited, I'm also very curious to see what happens next. If world building has always been an art that captures the human experience in the creation of thousands of people, lands, and webs that almost surpasses even our own understanding, what does it mean if we're able to reproduce those systems not through decades of creation, but rather through the application of program systems, rules to create worlds as procedural content generation does? At the very least, it would force us to reevaluate world building as an art form, but potentially even what it means to be an art form itself. The field of humanities has been defined by the difficulty, if not the simple impossibility, to replicate with anything but a skilled artist and was beyond the comprehension of systems and procedures. But if procedural world building continues to develop in the direction it seems to be headed, we may very well need to challenge that assumption. Hey guys, thanks for listening to me rant about world building for a bit. Like I said at the beginning, I've attached the documents to references I used when writing the script below. If anything I talked about strikes you as interesting, I'd really recommend you guys give it a look. Otherwise, guys, thanks a ton, keep being awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.